We have a little bit of time for question and answer. I'm sorry, with such a great panel of 4 speakers, that we have so little time. It's a little bit unfairly distributed. The next panel will get no time, so it all works out. Ben.
So I think this question is for Jamie. And the question has to do with what we know about when people's ideologies change. And so thinking specifically about equality, one way to think about the question is there a breaking point, right? Is there a moment at which things become so unequal that the palliative ideology can no longer function? And I mean, it's interesting to think about that in 1934, but then, of course, it's interesting to think about it now. And so I'm wondering whether social psychologists have any sense of how that works, and whether there's any predictive mechanisms we have for when these ideologies will change.
Right, yeah, no, I mean, I don't have any data that speaks to that directly. One of the things that I have been looking at is how the contents of ideology has been changed to kind of get in line with the changing system. So one of the things that we're finding is that the correlation between conservatism and these acceptance of inequality measures is getting higher over time. So it's becoming a bigger part of the ideology as it's becoming more of a societal problem. But you're right that there's got to be a breaking point. I mean, intuitively you would think that that would be the case. There could be a question of if we were reaching that breaking point now with this sort of failure of a free market ideology, and I don't know yet. That's going to be something to look at right now. It's an interesting question of how to justify the system when these rationalizations don't work so much. So in particular, the reason that I think that the palliative function works is because you can believe the rationalization. They're not just saying that. They truly believe, that if you do X, then Y will happen. You work harder and you can improve. And if that premise starts failing, then it will no longer serve a palliative function.
Bernard?
So I had this sense that on this choice panel, I got this feeling that kind of there was a general sense that more choice, that choice has negative consequences, or that there are kind of these relations between kind of reducing choice as having better outcomes. The Parisian parents, for instance, are happier with less choice. The prize for the kid, it's only, it's not just you add the choice that's bad, the jam studies, etc. And so I just wanted to think about other situations where kind of less choice is worse, or and I'm thinking here of the work of Robert Cover, for instance, in Justice Accused on the Fugitive Slave Act, and Robert Weisberg in the death penalty context and deregulating death. And one of the things that's common to both of those areas is the reducing choice, for instance, in the death penalty context, actually reducing choice gives jurors more of a crutch to impose a death sentence. And so the system before 1972 was that jurors were told, the law gives you no guidance. You have to decide. You have to look in your inner self and decide, in your own conscience, and decide whether you think the person should live or die. And then after 72 and 76, we start imposing all of these kind of restrictions on choice. Aggravating circumstances have to outweigh mitigating circumstances, and it's viewed as a situation that gets constrained. And it's because of the constraint that it actually, the less choice ends up serving as a crutch that enables a juror to impose the death penalty more easily because they don't feel that it's their own responsibility, right? And I think we saw that in Cover's work. It was kind of Justice Shaw, right, who was depending more on the formality of the law, serving as a crutch. So I'm wondering if kind of choice is a double-edged sword, or if we want to think about it in those ways, or whether that helps us think about it in any way.
Isn't that completely consistent with what Sheena found, though? I mean, you're talking about a situation where you want people for it to be as hard as possible for people to make a choice, and when you And when you establish guidelines, you make it, that is restrict choice, you make it easier. So that's consistent with everything that Sheena has found. Limit options and people are more likely to choose. You've just found one circumstance where you want people to be paralyzed rather than liberated.
The only question then is, I mean, is there any normative punch to the work on choice, or is it, again, is it indeterminate in the sense that, okay, well, there's some places where we're going to want more choice and some places where we're going to want less choice, and it's going to depend more on our political objectives than on anything about choice itself. In other words, it's just another tool. Sometimes it's useful, sometimes it's not, you know, and that's it.
There's certainly evidence to suggest that more choice is not all bad. And I certainly pointed out some of the contexts in which it's got some detrimental effects. But, you know, Chris Anderson's book on the long tail is a real effect. It is the case. I mean, there's actually two effects, actually, when you look at, say, things like online shopping, say. You have both the long tail effect and you have the head effect. Which is the idea that, on the one hand, as the marketplace of choice expands, you have fewer people taking advantage of the greater and greater variety that they have now at their disposal. However, you do have that small minority of individuals that are taking advantage of the sort of tail, these things that they ordinarily would not have at their disposal. Also, you would imagine that as people develop expertise in a particular domain of specialization, that with one of the things that expertise and specialization gives you is the greater ability to contemplate new ways or new combinations of doing things, so that having the ability to have more choice could actually be very beneficial. Perhaps one of the greatest exemplars of, so I guess in my view, the greatest combination is actually in the domain of expertise. What happens is that you have expertise imposes a type of constraint on the way you think about things, on the way you can rule out that which will not work. And yet at the same time, because you have the expertise, you have freedom to actually pursue new combinations. And I think one of the greatest exemplars of that in our culture was jazz and improvisation.
David?
I suppose this kind of builds on the last two questions. I did find myself wondering, as you were all speaking about social change, I mean, you're all referencing, I think, ample work that's been done in the last few years that suggests that people are highly influenceable or malleable or don't know what they're doing often or sometimes when they make their choices. And I think that does raise the very general question of, well, then how do people change, and how does that, what do they do? What do they mean when they've changed? Do they even know that is there sense that they've changed their minds, they've changed their vote? I'm not as conservative as I used to be. Is that coming after the fact or before? And I guess to make that very specific, I'd like to ask, could institutions be doing more to help people, given the kind of data that you've presented? For example, could we ban this high to low kind of presentations of choices on the grounds that, you know, we don't let people drive drunk, we don't let people take drugs, we know this makes them pay more for stuff they don't want, so why not ban it? Would that be a way that a legal structure could help people to manage themselves, or is that in itself an ideological choice? I'm just wondering what any of you would make of that.